Welcome to One Word Stories. My name is Joanna Zell, and I'm really, really happy to host a very special and very young guest of mine, Lolo Mayer. A very warm welcome, Lolo.
Thank you, Joanna.
You are in a beautiful setting, Lolo. I love the background. And whenever I see the blossoming trees, I also need to think of the trees of Jarakanda. Is it the right
Mm.
name?
Yeah, the jacaranda trees.
The
Yes.
Jacaranda trees, yes. This is how I met your mom, actually, Claude Hélène Mayer. And this is how I met you, because we met actually a couple of years ago at the Intercultural Conference in Dublin. And back then, you had really a very, very powerful presentation on storytelling. So I'm really, really curious to hear from you, as I have said, my youngest guest, how you relate to storytelling practices, and also what is your story and how young people, also your age, can work with their stories so that they see it as a source of empowerment so that they can embrace them. So let us get started. What is your story, Lolo?
My story specifically is the story of how me in my race and in my skin color also, how I have embraced my power and how I have used storytelling to do so. As you know, because you have seen me in Dublin. As you know, I do give speeches. I do tell stories. I do also write stories with my mother to help others also embrace their power and help others embrace their power also through race and in terms of storytelling as well. So my story is very much a story of stories.
Hmm. Yeah. So maybe just a little bit of context for everybody who is listening to us. You were born and raised in South Africa.
Yes.
Nevertheless, you travel on the regular basis to Europe, particularly to Germany, where your mom originally comes from. And right now, you are also traveling to the US, and it's not the first time. So, yeah, this is also something that leads me to another question. What differences do you see between these three very, very different corners of the world regarding the perception of skin color, and particularly your experiences?
I think that it's like in South Africa, just for terms of comparison, in South Africa, skin color is very much a non-issue so much as it is just a point that people make. Because South Africa is very much a country of people with darker skin, versus, for example, Germany, which is very much a country where the predominant skin color is people of a lighter skin tone. So in South Africa, race is not so much of an issue because they've had a history of apartheid and a system very much of racial oppression. So it is an issue. It is a point that is working on being reformed currently in South Africa that I know of versus say in Germany, who have very much a predominantly lighter skin color and very much also a white population. It's very much not even talked about in Germany and also in America. It's very much not talked about because for those two countries, their history of the less savory parts of racial oppression, say, uh, are very much in the past. Like it's not as recent as it maybe was for South Africa. So in South Africa, it is a lot more talked about and a lot more prevalent than it is in Germany or the US that I know of. I will say this is all based on my experience with these issues, but in South Africa, it is a lot more talked about, but as a point of reformation versus as a point of say, negativity or oppression.
Mhm. So that it's still much more present, much more relevant because of the very recent history. This guides me to a different question. The stories of belonging, because when we talk about working with stories, we so much talk also about what actually makes us feel somewhere comfortable and being able to open up and really to share our stories, and what might actually block us in different contexts. And again, the question is about your own experiences, how you yourself perceive, this dynamics of sharing stories in different contexts.
Sharing stories, I will say, just going first, sharing stories very much is a universal process. Like it's very much like with everything I do, I share a story. I share my story, perhaps I share even your story. Like with everything I do, there is a story, there is a reason, there is a meaning. So sharing a story in its all-encompassing sort of universality, if that is a word, sharing stories is it's less dependent on the external context, I find, and more dependent on which story I share. So if I share my story, it's very much a personal matter for me. Like even if I'm standing on stage and delivering a speech to share my story and to share my stories of power, and it's very much a personal matter for me. But if I share, for example, oh, I don't know, a story about the history of what it is that I do, or the history of the stories that I tell as well, or like the history of race and power, then it's very much something I can talk about much more easily, say. But a lot of it does depend on how I'm feeling at the day, on the day.
Yeah, exactly. That it's not only context based, but definitely the form of the day based, as you say, and also this very conscious choice of stories. Huh?
Mm.
How much you want to reveal in a certain moment. How can we actually work with stories in the anti-racism context? What are the stories that are empowering people?
The stories I find that very much empower people are stories of freedom fighters, are stories of people who have done change, people who have committed themselves to change, like say Frederick Douglass.
Mhm.
He was a very successful member of the movement against slavery here in the United States, or very much closer to home, the story of Nelson Mandela. He was a man who committed himself to change, and I think that just stories, and also not just success stories. Failure is not like in a negative context now, but failure is very much a part of power.
Mhm.
So realistic expectations and stories, also realistic stories, because fantasy is it's good as a bedtime story, I find.
Mm.
But also realistic stories, like Nelson Mandela, he went to jail, like for a period of several years. So also realistic stories about power and realistic stories about people taking back their power. But in the end, success stories and stories of successes also are important in helping people process their power and helping people reclaim also their power, and also especially in terms of race, because it is a battle. It is.
What do you think? What was helpful in your case to reclaim your story?
First and foremost, the most helpful influence was
Mhm.
probably my mother, because it was her support also, and that is the first point, a support structure. that has to be a support structure. And in the case of my mother, it was her support that enabled me to even gather, say, the courage
Mm.
to, deliver my speeches and tell the stories that I do. And also in my case, what was helpful was I act, so I have experience with storytelling, but especially storytelling to people. If you want to be able to reclaim your power through storytelling, you have to be able to tell your story, but more importantly, you have to be able to tell a story. There's no storytelling without a story. So that is very important, but especially in my case, it's, I think, just the life experience of traveling about, being part of such a multicultural family and also society as well, has, I think, exposed me a lot more to various stories in my life than I think I would have had I, say, not been part of the family that I am or not traveled around the way that I do. So it is definitely an experience with multiculturalism as well.
Mhm. Yeah. I remember back then in Dublin, you were talking quite a lot also about the identity issue in terms of this narrative identity. How can people relate to it when, just like in your case, they are part of this multicultural, not only surrounding in South Africa, but also family, and yes, the very, very close surrounding of family members and friends.
I think that identity is very much a foe in the battle you fight. It's always going to be there. There's always going to be a question of, say, do I belong here? Do I not? And identity, my identity, I will say it. This does relate specifically to me, and I'm not sure if this relates to other people as much. But my identity specifically has been in question for a long time, and just by myself personally. And I resolved that, so to speak, through storytelling and through being able to package sort of my identity very neatly into several like stories and to weave it into a narrative that makes sense. So identity is just a point of contact. It's going to be a point of contact and perhaps a point of friction, but as long as you can get it to make sense for you, I think that you'll be fine with your identity. You'll be all right, everything will work out because as long as you have your own identity, there's no one who can tell you otherwise.
Hmm. What I hear is that it's a process, and you also use very powerful words like a battlefield, maybe also to see exactly the same situation from different perspectives. This is what I could imagine that can be very
Absolutely.
helpful. So this narrative identity is very, very interesting, especially when we think of, this long, long history of psychology when Piaget, but also beforehand, obviously, Freud insisted that in the adulthood, also Erikson. Erikson was such a very, very big name. And the psychologists say they said that, oh, this in the adulthood the identity is formed, and this is where people know who they are. And currently, exactly, all of us, we can laugh about it because it's a continuous process, and we are, as you have just said, just meaning making creatures. So we keep telling ourselves different stories, and it's about how we relate to the stories, how we make meaning out of them, how we perceive ourselves and form our identity in different, not only stages in life, but also in different cultural contexts. Yeah. Very, very, very powerful. And by the way, apropos word powerful, you have said a couple of times during our conversation that it's so much about power.
Yes.
The
Yes, yes, it is.
phenomenon of telling stories. Could you give a concrete example when you really felt empowered? In which situation?
I can, actually. Okay, so firstly, a backstory.
Exactly.
When I was just a little lad, about half the age I am now, at the tender age of 8, I don't know. I was. I used to do a lot of gymnastics, and I was part of the gymnastics class also. And it happened on one occasion that there was a boy who had a birthday, and me and my brother, we were the only two children of a darker skin color in the whole gymnastics course. This was in Germany. This was in Germany. And the child, he brought cake. He did. He brought cake for his birthday to share around with the group. So, me being, me, I go and I ask for a piece of cake for myself and my brother, and I get told that no, I can't have some because he refuses to share with, I'm going to paraphrase here, people of darker skin color.
Mhm.
And for the longest time, I didn't know how to feel about that. Um, and I, I did. I explored how I felt about it. And I explored it in depth. I did a lot of introspection. Well, this was all later. I didn't immediately sit down and, you know.
Oh, yeah.
But I did. I did a lot of introspection. I reviewed very much how that made me feel. And I realized I didn't have a problem so much with the implicit racism of the statement, so much as I did with how it affected me. But I was made to feel powerless through
Mhm.
that interaction. I was made to feel somehow lesser because of my skin color. And through telling that story and through developing that tale also, and through telling it to people on stage, and also just more in a personal context, I realized, just to myself, I realized that I don't have to be lesser. I don't have to be less powerful because of something that someone says to me. So, in that case, very much I felt that storytelling helped me reclaim the power that I had lost in that situation.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for sharing this story. It reveals lots of vulnerability.
Mm.
And right now, of course, one can talk about it with much more difference. Back then, it's for a kid. Yes, a
Yeah.
shocking moment. One cannot really make sense out of it. And still, what I hear is really this reauthoring attempt. Yeah, so really, as you say, reclaiming the power of your own story and being the author and saying, hey, such a stupid bigot behavior cannot impact how I feel in general. Yeah, it can maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, have an impact a little bit on the mood
Yeah,
in certain
of
situations,
course.
rather let not on my um, identity, how I perceive myself. Mm,
Also, because identity fundamentally is a long term thing. Identity is very much in the long term. Identity is developed in the long term. Identity is never immediate.
mm,
Identity is never changed in the moment. Identity is very much developed over time. And so I can stop it from impacting my identity in the long term, how I feel in the short term matters less.
Yeah.
Because if it stays with me, therein lies what I feel is the problem. If it stays with me, if I let it seriously impact me to a degree where I am made less powerful in the long term by this interaction, then it is an issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course, multicultural identity or identity in general, obviously isn't formed in a vacuum. So you have said that your groups of support in this process were definitely your family members, particularly your mom, who was very, very supportive. Um, and when I think of, this turn currently with anti-racist movement, but also decolonialization, and hearing more and more voices from the so-called global South, I immediately have to think of colleagues, friends from different African countries who actually say, oh, we were kind of neglected of our own stories. The stories of Europeans were imposed. So without even, I don't know, this necessity, everybody was talking about weather. Yes, just like British people, for example, do, or I don't know, Dutch or whoever else. And it was completely different reality. And the same world of obviousness also impacted curricula in different schools. This brings me to my question because, as you know, I was really, really eager to hear from you uh, whether you see any attempts also in the school system and also in, for example, different books, that there are actually more and more stories from South Africa, from different, communities that are part of the program and not all same, the stories that are imposed by different Western Europeans. Has it changed?
I I don't think it has changed in general. Say microcosm, it hasn't changed so much as it has been trying to.
Mhm,
Because I did take various classes on African history. I did take classes also that were taught by various authorities on traditional African history and traditional stories. And in those classes, I did learn a lot about these stories that were, say, removed or stolen by colonialism and by the era of colonialism, or that were lost in the era of colonialism. So there are new classes now, and there are new systems in place to sort of develop and unlose
mhm,
those stories.
mhm.
So it is an attempt at change. But in my personal belief, I don't think it will be change until African history is just history. Until the class African history, until the separate course African history, until the elective African history, or African stories, or African artifacts, or African this, just becomes a module history, a module stories, a module. So there is attempted change, but I think integration and execution of an idea is needed.
Mhm. So do I understand it in the correct way that it's still not compulsory, that it's that the students can choose?
Yes, yes, it is. It was an elective course when I took it, so I can't speak for every school
Yeah,
in
sure.
South Africa or even every school in Africa, but it was an elective course when I took it, and at the schools that I've been, it was very much an elective. So it wasn't a mandatory subject. It wasn't a subject that you would take and then drop. Like for example, I dropped history as a subject
Mm-hmm.
because it was just the same repetitive material.
Mm-hmm.
So I dropped history as a subject, and then I took the elective course of study African history over the more generalized Western history. So it's not a subject that you could take and then drop, where you learn about African history and can decide that you then don't need to learn any more. It's a subject where, for the longest time, you're not introduced to it, and then when you can choose your own subjects, you have the option of learning about it.
I understand. Yeah, so this is the tricky part about it, definitely, yes, because it's got lots of impact on how we see ourselves as part of bigger communities. And yes, to hear this important voices is crucial in this context. Thank you very, very much, Lolo. I'm just, thinking about one more question, obviously. The very last question that doesn't have so much to do with our context, nevertheless, it introduces or maybe invites a short story, because this is the question I ask all my guests. How and what actually happened in the past that they had to struggle with a certain situation, and what was helpful in the situation? When I started all this, it was during the pandemic, so it was a lot about, dealing with stress, and words such as perseverance, creativity, writing arose. Right now, I would be interested to hear from you what is such a magic word, and what is the story behind what was the situation and what was helpful to solve it.
My word is power. And very broad word, very big word, I know. But I have chosen that word specifically because one crystallizing, so to speak, event in my life was very much the pandemic. It was very much sitting inside for 2 years with nothing to do. It was online schooling. It was not being able to go out. So, one event in my life that made me choose that word was very much the pandemic and being completely isolated, so to speak. So, I chose power because before the pandemic, it was it was very much power of my story, it was power of myself, it was power over myself as well. And it was power through storytelling, it was power through telling my story to people, it was power through coming to realize my own story, power through writing my own story. And I've chosen power today because it's less about the word itself and more about the evolution of the word and about the evolution of what the word means to me. So before the pandemic, as I said, it was the power of my story. It was the power of the stories I tell. It was the power of writing my story. In the pandemic, it was me and my family in one house. So there was no one to tell my stories to. There was only me to write my stories. It was also a lack of support structures in storytelling because before then it was obviously my family, it was my family members, it was my mother, it was my brother, it was my sister, but there were also very much external influences. Like there were my schoolmates, there were my teachers, there were various clubs and groups that I had been a part of that I was not then during the pandemic. So power became very much less the power of the stories I could tell or the stories I could write, but more so the power of the story within me. it was the power of not my story, but the story of me. It was the power within myself to be at peace with the story that I didn't have to tell. So
Mm.
power became a lot less of an expressive word. It became a lot less of an expression of power and more so the power to accept myself, the power to live with myself and my story, and the power to be at peace.
Very powerful words. It's such a long process that there are many adults who envy you at this point.
Uh,
Lolo, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your insights, your experiences, and also how storytelling helped you, not only in moments of struggle, but in general to make sense out of this, what is happening around you, and also insight. And I wish you all the best because you have actually graduated from school. So applause for your A-level exams. And yeah, and I wish you right now great, interesting choices. Really great time of experimenting. You are acting, you are modeling, so also lots of fun and satisfaction in these areas. And currently, a wonderful time in the US. Enjoy your holiday.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you very much. I would also like to just thank you for allowing me to tell my story once again in terms of power, in terms of race, and also for conducting this interview with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.